Dust Creek, Arizona, 1887. The word cut through the town square like a gunshot. Barren. Eleanor Callahan felt her face burn. The afternoon sun pressed down on her shoulders, but the heat she felt came from inside, from shame she'd carried for 3 years. Silas McGraw stood on the church steps, Bible raised high above his head. His voice rolled across the square, deep and certain, bouncing off the wooden storefronts. "Be fruitful and multiply," he shouted, "the Lord's first command to mankind." It wasn't a sermon, it was a sentence. Everyone knew who he meant. The widow, childless, worthless. Mothers pulled their children closer as if barrenness could spread like fever. Men shook their heads slowly, lips pressed tight. Whispers drifted on the desert wind. God's punishment, divine judgment, cursed. Nora tried to hold herself straight, tried to keep her chin level, but inside, a voice whispered that maybe they were right. 3 years of marriage, not one child. Thomas dead now 3 months, and her still here, still empty. Her hand found the small silver locket at her throat, pressed it hard against her chest. The metal was warm from her skin. Inside it, nothing, just empty space that only she knew about. Her eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. She turned away from the crowd, from Silas's booming voice, from the staring faces. Her feet moved quickly across the packed dirt, carrying her away from judgment she couldn't escape. Near the general store, her boot caught on the wooden step. She stumbled forward, arms flailing, almost fell. A hand caught her elbow, firm, steady. She looked up into the face of a stranger. Tall, worn hat pulled low, dust on his boots like he'd been riding for days. His eyes were dark, direct, the kind of eyes that saw things. In his other hand, a closed knife, wood handle, dark with age, carved into it a simple cross. He didn't preach, didn't offer pity, didn't even smile. He just leaned close enough that only she could hear his words. Never trust them. 3 words, not comfort, warning. Then he released her arm, touched the brim of his hat, and stepped back into the shadows between buildings. Nora stood frozen, heart pounding. She didn't know his name, didn't know where he'd come from or why he'd spoken to her. But something in those 3 words felt like the first honest thing anyone had said to her in months. She walked home alone as the sun dropped toward the horizon, one hand still pressed to the locket at her throat. And nothing in Dust Creek would ever be the same. 5 years ago, Eleanor had arrived in Dust Creek as a bride. The stagecoach had kicked up clouds of red dust that day, coating her best traveling dress, settling into every fold of fabric, but she hadn't cared. Thomas Callahan stood waiting at the station, hat in his hands, that shy smile on his face that made the whole world feel less harsh. Thomas didn't own land, didn't have money put away. But he had calloused hands that knew how to work, a quiet laugh that came easy, and a kindness that made hard things bearable. He'd known about her condition before he ever proposed. Back in Philadelphia, the doctors had used careful words. Difficulties conceiving. Unlikely to carry to term. Perhaps impossible. They'd spoken in low voices, as if infertility was something shameful that needed whispering. But when Nora told Thomas, afraid he'd walk away, he'd just taken her hands in his and said 3 words. "You're enough." Not, "it doesn't matter." Not, "we'll see." Just, "you're enough." They'd tried for 3 years. Every month they'd hoped. Every month that hope died quiet and painful. The traveling doctor who passed through Dust Creek twice a year finally confirmed what Nora already knew in her bones. Her body wouldn't give them children. She'd taken the silver locket from around her neck that night, her mother's locket. Inside, nothing. Her mother used to keep locks of her children's hair there, tiny curls preserved like prayers. Nora had nothing to put inside, just empty space. She'd worn it anyway, carried that emptiness against her heart every single day. The emptiness became a companion. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between chores, she'd open the locket and stare at the smooth silver interior, imagining what it would feel like to tuck a tiny curl inside, to snap it shut, knowing a piece of her child lived there, close to her heart. Other women spoke of their children with such casual ease. My Sarah said the funniest thing yesterday. Little James is teething again. Their words were windows into a world Nora could see, but never enter. She learned to smile and nod, learned to ask the right questions, learned to carry her grief like a stone in her pocket, always there, occasionally touched, never shown. Thomas understood. He never asked her to pretend the loss wasn't real, never told her to simply be grateful for what they had. He just held her hand tighter on the hard nights. That was love, not fixing the unfixable, just refusing to let her carry it alone. The whispers started slow, women at the general store, voices dropping when she walked past, glances in church that felt like judgments. Nobody said it directly, but she heard it in their silence. Barren, cursed, unnatural. Even without accusations, she condemned herself. Every night alone with Thomas, wondering why God had made her body this way, wondering what she'd done to deserve it. Then, 3 months ago, everything changed. A stupid fight over water rights. 2 neighbors, both desperate from the drought, both convinced the creek belonged to them. Voices got loud, hands went to guns. Thomas tried to step between them, tried to be the peacemaker he always was. The shot cracked across the desert air like thunder. Thomas fell. The dry ground drank his blood until there was nothing left to give. Since that day, their small house felt like a tomb. His coffee cup still sat on the kitchen shelf, the handle chipped from where he'd dropped it once. His work shirt still hung on the peg by the door, smelling of leather and tobacco and sweat. The smell of him. She couldn't bring herself to wash it, couldn't bring herself to put it away. At night, she lay on her side of the bed, staring at the empty space where he used to sleep. The locket burned against her chest, her mother's locket, empty like her womb, empty like her house, empty like her future. But there was one thing left, one thing that still needed her. The school. Samuel Garrett had built it 6 years ago. He'd been a merchant, a widower, who'd lost his wife and 2 children crossing the plains. No family left to inherit his money, so he'd done something else with it. Bought land, built a schoolhouse, hired a teacher. When he died 3 years back, he'd left a will. The school had to stay a school for at least 20 years. For the children who had come after him, the ones his own children would never be. Thomas had helped her get the teaching position after Garrett died. The town respected Thomas, trusted his judgment. They'd given Nora the job because of him. Now he was gone, and that school, with its leaking roof and worn floorboards and 20 bright faces looking up at her every morning, that was all she had. The building was weathered, paint peeling off the wooden walls. 3 buckets sat permanent in the classroom, catching rain from holes nobody had money to fix. The children came tired, some with boots held together by hope and wire. But for a few hours each day, they weren't just survivors scratching life from desert dirt. They were students, they were futures, they were possibility. It wasn't much, but it was hers. And she'd be damned if she'd let anyone take it away. The morning after Silas's sermon, Nora stood in her classroom surrounded by voices that weren't accusations. "Miss Nora, is this how you spell courage?" "Teacher, Tommy took my slate. I finished the arithmetic problems, all of them." 18 children filled the weathered schoolhouse that morning. Some days there were 22. Today, 18 felt like enough. 3 buckets sat along the back wall, catching steady drips from the ceiling. Plip, plip, plip. The rhythm had become so familiar that Nora barely heard it anymore. Just another heartbeat in a room full of life. Lily Bennett sat in the front row, 9 years old, with her mother's green eyes and a stubborn set to her jaw. She held her slate carefully, tongue peeking out as she concentrated on her letters. Tommy, 7 and small for his age, sat 2 rows back. His clothes were patched 3 times over, but his eyes shone when he finally sounded out a full sentence without stumbling. Rebecca, 12 and nearly grown, helped the younger ones with their reading. She'd be leaving school soon, ready to work, but for now she was here, patient and gentle with children who still believed in futures. Nora moved between the desks with a piece of worn chalk, pointing out letters, praising effort, correcting mistakes with kindness. For these few hours, the weight in her chest lifted. The locket at her throat felt lighter. Here she wasn't barren. She wasn't cursed. She wasn't the widow everyone whispered about. She was Teacher Nora, and that meant something. It meant Lily would grow up knowing her letters. It meant Tommy wouldn't spend his life making an X where his signature should be. It meant Rebecca could read contracts before signing them, could write letters to family far away, could choose a different future than the one poverty insisted on. Education wasn't charity, it was weaponry, the kind that protected you from men like Silas, who counted on ignorance to maintain power. Every child who learned to read was a small revolution. And Nora was the quiet revolutionary nobody suspected. The door opened without a knock. The children's voices died like candles in wind. Silas McGraw filled the doorway, black coat dusty from the road, Bible clutched in one hand. His pale eyes swept the room, taking inventory, measuring, judging. "Children," he said, voice smooth as oil, "good morning." A few mumbled responses, most just stared. Nora's hand found the edge of her desk, gripped it. "Mr. McGraw, school is in session." "Yes." He stepped inside, boots heavy on the wooden floor. "That's exactly why I'm here." He turned to face the children, and Nora's stomach dropped. Whatever he was about to say, it wasn't for her. It was for them. "A school without a mother," Silas announced, voice carrying to every corner, "is like a home without a roof, incomplete, unnatural." Lily's fingers tightened around her slate. "The railroad is coming to Dust Creek," he continued. "Progress, prosperity, a future for this town." He gestured around the leaking classroom. "This building sits on valuable land that could serve the community. The church council and I have discussed this at length." Nora felt her throat close. This school is protected. Silas smiled, not with warmth, with victory already tasted. Protected by a dead man's wishes, but the council serves the living. His eyes found hers, cold and certain. A woman without children teaching other people's children. The council questions the wisdom of it, questions what kind of influence such a woman provides. Rebecca's chair scraped as she half rose, protective fury in her young face. Nora raised one hand slightly. Wait. Within the month, Silas said, this building will be sold to the railroad. Depot storage, most likely. The children will manage without formal schooling. They always have. Tommy's hand crept out, small fingers grabbing a handful of Nora's skirt. She felt him shaking. Something in her chest caught fire. As long as I'm standing, Nora said, voice low but clear, this will be a school. Salisa's smile widened. Then I suppose we'll see how long you stand. He turned, black coat swirling, and walked out into the morning sun. The door closed behind him. The silence that filled the room wasn't peaceful anymore. It was a threat. The next morning, Nora heard boots on the school's front steps before the sun had fully burned off the desert chill. She was inside, alone, stacking the children's slates for the day ahead. Her hands moved automatically, but her mind was elsewhere, on Silas's words, on the railroad, on how quickly solid ground could turn to sand beneath your feet. The knock came soft, respectful. She opened the door to find the stranger from the town square. Up close, she could see the details. The hat wasn't just worn, it was sun-bleached and sweat-stained, the kind of hat that had seen years of hard miles. His face was weathered, lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting into too many sunrises. The dark beard was neat despite the dust on his clothes. And those eyes, still direct, still seeing. Ma'am, he touched the brim of his hat, I need to ask a favor. Nora's hand tightened on the doorframe. I don't know you. No, ma'am, you don't. He shifted his weight, and she noticed the worn saddlebag slung over one shoulder. But I need someone who can read, someone who won't run straight to the council with questions. He knew about the council, about her position. Nora glanced past him at the empty street. Too early for curious eyes. She stepped back. Come in. He entered like he was used to small spaces, moving careful not to knock anything over. He set the saddlebag on her desk, worked the buckle with calloused fingers. From inside he pulled a folded paper. Old leather had kept it dry, but the edges were still worn soft from handling. He laid it flat on the desk between them. Nora leaned forward. At the top, an embossed seal, ornate letters spelling out Arizona Central Railroad Company. Her pulse quickened. I need you to tell me what it says, he said quietly. All of it. She pulled the paper closer, angling it toward the morning light coming through the window. Her eyes moved over the text, and with each line, her chest grew tighter. Contract terms, land purchases, prices negotiated, routes planned through Dusk Creek, transforming the small desert town into a cargo transfer point, estimates for depot construction, timelines for demolition of non-essential structures. Her finger stopped on a list of properties. The school's address was there, marked for acquisition. But it was the signature at the bottom that made her breath catch. Silas McGraw, witness and community representative. She looked up at the stranger. Where did you get this? His jaw tightened. Does it matter? It matters to me. He was quiet for a moment, eyes moving to the window, watching the empty street. Man in the saloon 2 towns over, drinks too much, talks more. Had it in his coat when he passed out. I figured someone should know what's coming. You stole it. I borrowed it. The corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile. He got it back. Just took me a few days to return it. Nora looked back at the document. Her hands trembled slightly. "Silas is working with them. He's been planning this." "Yes, ma'am." "The sermon yesterday, the humiliation, it wasn't just cruelty." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "It was strategy." The stranger nodded slowly. "They need you gone, need the school empty so nobody fights when they tear it down." The words from the town square came back to her. "Never trust them." She met his eyes. "Why are you showing me this?" He held her gaze, and something passed between them. Recognition, maybe. The kind two people have when they've both learned that the world breaks things it shouldn't. "Because they think you're alone," he said simply. Before she could respond, he reached into the saddlebag again. This time, he pulled out a cloth bundle, set it on the desk beside the document. She opened it. Flour, dried beans, salt, basic supplies, but good quality. "I can't," she started. "You didn't ask for it." He was already moving toward the door. "Consider it payment for the reading." "Wait," Nora stepped forward. "I don't even know your name." He paused in the doorway, silhouetted against the rising sun. "Caleb." "Just that. One word, no last name offered." Then he was gone, boots crunching across the dirt yard, toward where his horse stood waiting. Nora moved to the window, watched him swing into the saddle with practiced ease, watched him turn the horse toward the open desert. The dust from his leaving hung in the still morning air, golden in the early light. Slowly it settled. Nora stood there, hand pressed against the window glass, the railroad document still spread on her desk behind her. For the first time since Thomas died, since Silas's first cruel sermon, since the whispers started following her through town, she didn't feel invisible. Someone had seen her fight worth fighting for. And that changed everything. She looked down at the document again. The neat columns of numbers, the efficient legal language, the signature that made her stomach turn. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about 18 children who deserved better than becoming tools for Silas's profit. About a town that deserved to know when its spiritual leader was trading their future for railroad money. About Thomas, who'd believed in her enough to fight for this teaching position, who'd stood before the council and vouched for her character when others whispered doubts. He'd given her this chance, fought for it, and she'd be damned if she'd let Silas McGraw take it without a fight. The decision settled in her chest like a stone foundation, solid, unmovable. She wasn't running, not this time. And a week passed like water through cupped hands. Slow, inevitable, slipping away. The atmosphere in Dust Creek changed the way weather changes before a storm. You couldn't point to one moment, one specific shift, but you felt it in your bones. Mothers who used to drop their children at the school's front steps now walked them only halfway, lingered at the edge of the yard, watched Nora through narrowed eyes before finally, reluctantly, letting their children go inside. Some mornings only 12 children came, then 10. Men who used to nod politely when Nora passed now found fascinating things to study in the dirt at their feet. Conversations stopped when she walked by, resumed in whispers after she'd gone. In the town square, Silas preached louder than before. Oh, the future. His voice boomed across the packed earth, the Bible raised high like a battle standard. The future is in the railroad, in multiplication, in prosperity, in progress. People gathered to listen, more each day. God rewards those who build, Silas proclaimed, who expand, who bring forth life and legacy. His finger pointed skyward, but his eyes found Nora in the crowd. Those who remain barren remain behind. The crowd murmured approval. Some nodded. A few glanced at Nora with something like pity, others with contempt. She pulled her shawl tighter and walked away. At the general store, she waited her turn at the counter. Flour, coffee, the small essentials that kept a person alive when living felt like work. Martha Hayes stood nearby with her son, a boy of 8, who'd been in Nora's classroom just last week. The child saw Nora, smiled, started to wave. Martha's hand shot out, grabbed his wrist, pulled him back. "Morning, Martha," Nora said quietly. Martha's face was stone. "Eleanor!" Not even Miss Callahan anymore, just her first name, stripped of respect. The boy tugged at his mother's skirt. "Mama, that's teacher—" "Hush!" Martha's voice was sharp. She looked at Nora with something that might have been regret once, but had hardened into judgment. "He doesn't need to learn from someone who doesn't know how to be a mother." The words hit like a fist to the chest. The walk home blurred. Nora's feet moved automatically, carrying her down the familiar dirt road while her mind replayed Martha's words on an endless loop. "Doesn't know how to be a mother." As if motherhood was a skill you learned, like sewing or cooking. As if her body's failure was a choice she'd made, a lesson she'd simply refused to study. She thought of all the nights she'd lain awake, hand on her flat stomach, praying for movement that never came. All the time she'd sewn tiny clothes in secret hope, only to pack them away unused. All the names she'd chosen whispered to Thomas in the dark, names that would never be called across a dinner table or shouted from a porch. She knew how to be a mother. Her body just wouldn't let her prove it. And that difference between knowing and being able was a canyon too wide for people like Martha to see across. Nora's vision blurred. She turned away before Martha could see tears she refused to shed, left her coins on the counter, and walked out into the brutal afternoon sun without her supplies. The walk home felt endless. Every step whispered the same question: why keep fighting? Thomas was gone. The children were being pulled away one by one. The railroad was coming. Silas had the council, had the town, had God on his side if you believed his sermons. What did she have? A leaking schoolhouse, an empty locket, a reputation ruined by biology she couldn't control. Maybe they were right. Maybe she should just let go. She was halfway home when she heard hoofbeats behind her. Nora turned. Caleb sat astride his horse, silhouetted against the lowering sun. He didn't speak, didn't explain, just swung down from the saddle with a burlap sack in one hand. He set it at her feet, supplies, more flour, jerky, coffee, a small jar of honey. "You don't have to," she started. "I know." He touched his hat brim, climbed back into the saddle, and rode away without another word. Nora stood there holding the sack, watching the dust rise and fall in his wake. Not completely alone then. She turned toward home and nearly collided with Sarah Bennett. The younger woman stood at the edge of the path, a basket of mending in her arms. Her green eyes met Nora's, and something passed between them. Understanding. Solidarity. Sarah didn't speak. The risk was too great with eyes watching from every window. But she held Nora's gaze for 3 long heartbeats and nodded. Just once. Then she was gone, disappearing down the path toward her own small house. That night, Nora couldn't sleep. She lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind rattle the loose boards Thomas had always meant to fix. From the direction of town, she heard voices, laughter, the sounds of men drinking away the day's heat at the saloon. She rose, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, stepped out onto the porch. The voices carried clear on the desert air. "School's already half empty," someone said. Laughter followed. "Give it another week. Railroad man's coming through next month to finalize." That was Silas's voice, unmistakable, satisfied. "Soon that building's a depot, and that widow won't last another month without support." "To progress!" someone shouted. Glasses clinked, more laughter. Nora stood on her porch, the night pressing in from all sides. They were circling, tightening the noose, waiting for her to break. She pressed the locket against her chest, felt the empty space inside it. But when she looked up, she saw the school in the distance, dark, waiting. And further out, she imagined she could see dust on the horizon where a lone rider had passed. She was surrounded, but not completely alone. Not yet. The storm came before dawn. Nora woke to the sound of rain hammering the roof like fists demanding entry. For a moment, wrapped in darkness and half-sleep, she thought it was Thomas at the door, home late from town. Then memory crashed back. Thomas was dead. The house was empty. And the school. She was out of bed before the thought finished forming. The schoolhouse sat dark against the pre-dawn sky, rain streaming off its weathered sides. Through the window she could see water pouring through the ceiling, not 3 leaks anymore. 7, maybe more. The books. Nora ran through the mud, nightgown soaked, before she reached the door. Inside, chaos. Water pooled on the floor, dripped from the rafters, streamed down the walls. The children's slates floated in puddles, papers scattered and soggy. She grabbed books off shelves, stacking them on the highest desk, moved the smaller ones to the windowsills, tried to stuff rags into the ceiling cracks, but the rain just laughed and found new ways through. Her hands shook from cold, from exhaustion, from the weight of knowing she couldn't do this alone. Couldn't save this place alone. A book slipped from her wet fingers, hit the floor with a sick splash. "Stories for Children," read the cover, pages bloated with water, ink bleeding. Nora stared at it, at all of it, and felt something crack inside her chest. Ma'am. She spun. Caleb stood in the doorway, water streaming from his hat, his coat dark with rain. He didn't ask permission. Just stepped inside, moved to where the worst leak poured through, looked up at the damaged rafters. "You got a ladder?" he asked. She pointed numbly to the storage closet. For the next 3 hours they worked in near silence. Caleb climbed into the rafters with boards and nails salvaged from the storage shed. Nora handed up tools, held the ladder steady, moved buckets as he redirected the water's path. The rain kept falling, their hands kept moving. By the time gray dawn light filtered through the clouds, the worst was contained, not fixed, but contained. Caleb climbed down, boots hitting the wet floor with a splash. His shirt was soaked through, hair plastered to his forehead. He looked like he'd been drowning and climbing at the same time. Nora bent to pick up the fallen book, Stories for Children. The pages stuck together, words lost forever. She held it out to him, ruined. Caleb took it, and something in his face changed, closed. His thumb traced the water-damaged cover, and she saw his throat work. "I had a daughter," he said, voice rough, barely above a whisper, "long time ago." The air in the schoolhouse went still. Measles took her. His eyes stayed on the book. She was 5, loved stories. I'd make them up when I couldn't read the words proper. She didn't care if I got them wrong. Nora's chest tightened. After she died, I thought God had cursed me. Caleb's grip on the book tightened. Thought I'd never be worth anything again, that everything I touched would just die. He finally looked up at her. You're not cursed, ma'am. You're just carrying weight nobody should have to carry alone. Something in Nora broke. Not collapsed, just opened. Her hand went to her throat, to the locket. She unclasped the chain with trembling fingers, held it out between them, and pressed the catch. The locket opened in her palm. Empty, just smooth silver catching the dim light. My mother kept locks of her children's hair here, Nora whispered. Tiny curls, proof they existed, proof she'd been a mother. Her voice cracked. I never had anything to put inside. She looked up at Caleb, and for the first time since Thomas died, let someone see the full weight of her grief. Everyone looks at me and sees what's missing, what I couldn't give, couldn't be. Caleb's hand moved slowly, carefully. His calloused fingers closed around hers, around the open locket between their palms. His hands were warm despite the cold rain, steady despite the storm. Empty doesn't mean worthless, he said. The words hung between them like a promise, like a truth she'd been searching for in the dark and finally found. Nora looked down at their joined hands. His were scarred, rough from years of hard living. Hers were stained with chalk dust and ink. Different hands, different scars, but the same understanding. When my daughter died, Caleb continued, voice barely above a whisper, I threw away everything, thought if I emptied my life of her memory, the pain would empty out too. His thumb traced a gentle circle on her knuckles. But it doesn't work that way. You just find something new to build, not replacing what's gone, building alongside it. Nora understood. The school, the children, they weren't replacements for the babies she'd never have. They were the life she could still choose to live. 4 words, but they settled into her chest like stones building a foundation. His thumb brushed across her knuckles, just once, barely contact. But it was the first gentle touch she'd felt in 3 months. Never trust them, Caleb said, echoing his first warning. Then his grip tightened slightly. But you can trust me. Nora couldn't speak, could only nod. They stood there, hands clasped around empty silver, while outside the rain finally began to ease. Later, after Caleb had gone and the sun broke through the clouds in weak streams, Nora began the work of drying out the classroom. She pulled the old storage trunk from the corner, looking for dry rags. Inside, beneath moth-eaten blankets and dusty supplies, her fingers found paper. Old paper, yellow with age, official seals pressed into wax. She lifted it into the light. Last will and testament of Samuel Garrett. Her heart began to pound. She read quickly, eyes scanning the formal language until she found it, the clause, right there in black and white. The property known as the Dust Creek Schoolhouse shall function as an educational institution for a period of no less than 20 years from the date of my death, to ensure the children of this community have access to learning. 20 years. Samuel Garrett had died in 1884. Only 3 years ago. Nora's hand shook as she held the document. The school was protected, legally, irrevocably, for 17 more years. Silas didn't know, or he knew and was counting on no one finding the proof. But she'd found it, and everything had just changed. The morning bell rang into empty air. Nora stood on the school steps, hand still on the rope, watching the road that led from town. No children came. Not Lily with her careful handwriting, not Tommy with his shy smile, not Rebecca helping the younger ones, not a single child. The sun climbed higher, the road stayed empty. Inside, the schoolhouse felt like a church after the congregation had left. 22 desks sat in neat rows, waiting for students who wouldn't come. The 3 buckets still caught water from the patched roof. Plip, 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 marking time in a room that no longer had purpose. Nora walked between the empty desks, her fingers trailing across the worn wood. Here, a child had carved their initials. There, ink stains from a spilled bottle. Evidence of life, of learning, of futures being built one lesson at a time. All gone now. Silas had won. His campaign of whispers and sermons and social pressure had worked. The parents had kept their children home. The school was dead without anyone having to lift a hammer. Nora sank into her chair at the front of the room and stared at the empty space before her. Thomas's voice echoed in her memory, "You're enough." But she wasn't, was she? Wasn't enough to keep him alive, wasn't enough to give him children, wasn't enough to protect this school from men who saw only profit where she saw purpose. The locket lay heavy against her chest. She reached up, unclasped it, held it in her palm. The silver caught the morning light streaming through the window, gleaming and empty and utterly useless. Just like her. Nora set it on the desk, gently, the way you set down something you're never picking up again. Then she stood and began packing. Books into crates, slates stacked and wrapped. Her few personal belongings, a shawl, a tin cup, the photograph of Thomas she kept in the desk drawer, gathered into a small bundle. She could take the stage to Tucson, find work as a seamstress maybe, or a housekeeper. Something anonymous, something where no one would know she was barren, cursed, a woman God had turned his back on. Somewhere she could disappear. Her hands moved automatically, packing away a life she'd tried so hard to build. The door opened. Nora didn't turn, probably Silas come to gloat, or the railroad man measuring his new depot. Eleanor. That voice made her turn. Sarah Bennett stood in the doorway, wind-blown and dusty, clutching a leather folder to her chest. Her green eyes were bright with something that looked like defiance. "Sarah," Nora's voice came out rough, "you shouldn't be here. People will talk." "Let them." Sarah crossed the room, set the folder on the desk. Her hands were shaking. "I rode to Silver Springs yesterday, to the county land registry office." Nora stared. "That's a full day's ride." "I know." Sarah opened the folder, pulled out official documents, pages thick with stamps and signatures. "I told everyone I was visiting my sister, but I went for these." The pages showed land deeds, transfer records, property ownership histories for Dust Creek. "I was judged too, you know," Sarah said quietly, "when my husband died. 27 years old, still young, still attractive, they said. Dangerous, a temptation to good men." Her jaw tightened. "They called me a widow who needed watching, who couldn't be trusted alone." Nora's throat closed. "So I know what it's like," Sarah met her eyes, "to be judged for things you can't control, to have people decide you're worth less because of what you've lost." Before Nora could respond, boots sounded on the steps outside. Caleb appeared in the doorway, hat in hand. He looked between them, seemed to understand immediately. "Ma'am," he nodded to Sarah, then focused on Nora, I got something you need to see. He pulled papers from inside his coat, the railroad contract, but this time, covered in pencil markings, notes in the margins, sections circled. I had someone in Tucson look at this proper, Caleb said. Someone who understands legal language. He laid it beside Sarah's documents. There's a clause here, page 4. Nora leaned forward, reading where his finger pointed. Sale of designated properties contingent upon absence of active public institutions or binding legal restrictions. Her breath caught. They can't buy the land if the school is operating, Caleb said, and they can't force it closed if there's legal protection, which there is. He glanced at the packing crates. If you walk away, Silas wins clean, but if you stay, if you fight... Sarah placed the registry documents beside the contract. If we can prove he sabotaged the school through intimidation and coercion, the sale becomes invalid. The railroad won't touch it with legal complications. Nora looked between them, at the documents spread across her desk, at the locket lying abandoned beside them, at the empty classroom behind her. He'll fight, she whispered. Yes, Caleb's voice was steady, but this time you won't be fighting alone. Sarah nodded. We call a public meeting, present the evidence, make them see what Silas really is. Nora's hand moved slowly toward the locket, picked it up, fastened it back around her neck. The weight felt different now. Not like a burden, like armor. When? She asked. But we need to be smart about this, Hera said, pulling out a small notepad, pages covered in careful handwriting. I've been watching Silas. He's been targeting families one by one, the ones who depend on the general store for credit, the ones who work for the church. Caleb nodded. He's been careful, made it look like parents' choice instead of his pressure. The will protects the building, Nora said slowly, understanding dawning. But if no children come, if the school just stops on its own, then he doesn't have to break any laws, Sarah finished. The school fails naturally. The railroad gets what it wants. Nora looked at the documents spread before her, at the locket in her hand, at the two people who'd risked everything to stand with her. Tomorrow, Caleb said, we make him answer for what he's done, in front of everyone. Before he knows what's coming, Sarah added. Nora fastened the locket around her neck. The weight felt different now. Not burden, armor. Tomorrow, she agreed. Caleb's mouth lifted slightly, almost a smile. Tomorrow, before Silas knows what's coming. Outside, the sun climbed toward noon. The empty schoolhouse waited. But Nora wasn't packing anymore. She was preparing for war. The church bell rang at noon. Not the gentle call to Sunday service, sharp, insistent, the sound of judgment being summoned. By the time Nora reached the town square, it seemed half of Dust Creek had gathered. Men leaned against storefronts, arms crossed, women clustered in small groups, fans moving despite the October coolness. Children peered from behind their mothers' skirts. In the center, Silas McGraw stood on a wooden crate, elevated above the crowd like a prophet on a mountain. His black coat was freshly brushed, his beard carefully combed. The Bible in his left hand caught the sunlight. In his right hand he held papers, the railroad contract. Friends, his voice boomed across the square. Neighbors, I've called you here today because this community faces a choice between past and future, between stagnation and progress. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded. Nora felt Caleb's presence beside her, solid, silent. Sarah stood on her other side, chin raised despite the hostile stares turning their way. "This town needs progress," Silas continued, raising the contract higher. "The railroad brings jobs, prosperity, a future for your children." He paused, letting the words sink in. Then his eyes found Nora. Not a dead school run by a cursed woman who can't even produce children of her own. The crowd's murmur grew louder. Some faces showed agreement, others uncertainty, but all watched. Nora's legs trembled. Her hands felt cold despite the sun beating down. 3 months ago, she would have turned and fled, would have accepted the judgment, swallowed the shame, disappeared. But her fingers found the locket at her throat, pressed against it, and something in her spine turned to steel. She stepped forward. "My infertility is not a curse." Her voice came out quieter than Silas's, but in the sudden silence it carried. "It's pain, real pain, pain I've carried for years." She looked around at the faces watching. "But pain doesn't make me less of a woman, and it doesn't make me less of a teacher." Silas laughed, sharp, mocking. "No children means no future. God's own words, be fruitful and multiply." He gestured to the crowd. "What kind of woman can't fulfill the most basic purpose?" A few people laughed with him, not many, but enough. Nora's hand moved to the locket, unclasped it, held it up so the sun caught the silver, made it gleam for everyone to see. Then she opened it. "You want to know what's inside?" Her voice was steady now, strong. "Nothing. It's empty. My mother kept locks of her children's hair in here, physical proof of the lives she'd brought into the world." She met Silas's eyes. "I have nothing to put inside, and everyone can see that emptiness." She turned slowly, showing the open locket to the crowd. "But value isn't in what's missing." Her voice rose. "It's in what we give anyway, what we choose to do even when the world says we're not enough." "Words!" Silas spat. "Empty words from an empty woman." "No." Sarah Bennett stepped forward and gasps rippled through the square. She pulled documents from her coat. "Not empty words. Truth. I rode to Silver Springs. Got these from the county land office." She held them high. "Silas McGraw has been intimidating families, threatening livelihoods, forcing parents to keep their children from school." "Lies." Silas's face reddened. "And this," Caleb's voice cut through the noise like a blade. He moved forward, holding the railroad contract. "This document requires absence of active public institutions before the railroad can purchase the school property." He looked at Silas. "You need the school to fail. That's why you've been destroying Eleanor's reputation, why you've been terrorizing parents." Nora pulled the final document from inside her shawl. Samuel Garrett's will. The paper was yellowed, but the words were clear. "Samuel Garrett's will," she announced, "protects this school for 20 years. It's been only 3. The school is legally bound to remain a school for 17 more years." Silas's mouth opened, closed. His eyes darted between the documents, the faces, searching for an escape. Then from the edge of the square a small voice called out, "Teacher Nora!" Lily Bennett emerged from behind a building, her hand clutching her slate. Behind her came Tommy, then Rebecca. Then more children. One by one they appeared from doorways and alleys, moving toward the center of the square. 18 children, 20, 22. They formed a line behind Nora, facing the crowd, facing their parents, facing Silas. Tommy, small and 7 and brave beyond his years, looked up at Silas and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. Teacher Nora is my family." The night before, Sarah had moved through Dust Creek like a shadow, door to door, whispering to parents in kitchens and on porches, showing them her documentation, explaining what Silas had really been doing. Some had slammed doors in her face, others had listened with growing anger, but a few, just a few, had nodded, had promised. And those few had talked to their children, had told them about the meeting, had asked quietly what they wanted. The children had decided for themselves. Now they stood in the square, slates clutched in small hands, facing down the man who'd tried to steal their future, not because adults had told them to, because they understood what was at stake. Lily had organized them that morning, met at the schoolhouse before dawn, made a plan. "We go together," she'd said, "all of us, so they can see." And here they were, 22 small acts of rebellion, 22 voices saying, "We matter." The words hung in the desert air. Whispers spread through the crowd like wind through wheat. Parents looked at their children, looked at Nora, looked at Silas with his Bible and his contract and his red, angry face. The whispers changed, shifted, turned. Silas closed the Bible with a sharp snap. His knuckles were white around the leather cover. His face was crimson, veins visible at his temples. But when he opened his mouth, no words came. Because his power had been built on whispers and shame and the silence of people too afraid to speak. And the silence had finally broken. He stepped down from the crate, gathered his papers with shaking hands, walked through the parting crowd without looking left or right. Alone? Defeated not by violence or exile, but by something far more devastating. The truth. The afternoon sun slanted through the schoolhouse windows, turning dust motes into gold. Inside, children's laughter echoed off the walls as they helped dry water-damaged books, carefully turning pages and laying them flat to catch the light. Tommy swept puddles toward the door with a broom almost as tall as he was. Rebecca organized the younger ones into teams, each with their own task. The roof still had weak spots, the floorboards still creaked, the paint still peeled. But now there were hands to fix it, voices to fill it, a future to grow in it. Near the window, Sarah and Lily worked side by side, restacking slates that had been scattered by the storm. Sarah's hand rested briefly on her daughter's shoulder, and Lily smiled up at her mother. Through the open door, Nora saw a figure pass on the road. Silas McGraw walked alone, Bible clutched under one arm, shoulders hunched against a wind only he could feel. People on the street didn't stop him, didn't call out. They simply let him pass. He didn't look toward the school, didn't look at Nora standing in the doorway. His defeat wasn't in what he said. It was in his silence. Nora watched until he disappeared around the corner, then turned back to the school, to the life returning to it. Ma'am. Caleb stood on the porch, hat in his hands, that almost smile touching his weathered face. "Looks like you won," he said. Nora's hand went to the locket at her throat, but this time she didn't press it like a wound. She adjusted it, gently, the way you adjust something precious. "Not me," she said, gesturing to the children working and laughing inside. "Them." Caleb's eyes followed her gesture, then returned to her face. Never met a woman so stubborn. Something warm bloomed in Nora's chest. Stubborn, or cursed? His smile deepened, just slightly. "Stubborn." He paused, and his voice dropped lower. "And necessary." The word settled between them like a foundation stone, not useful or good enough, necessary, as if the world needed her exactly as she was, empty locket and all. Nora felt something shift in her chest, not healing. Grief didn't heal like broken bones, but acceptance, the kind that lets you carry loss without being crushed by it. My daughter's name was Anna, Caleb said suddenly, quietly. I haven't said it out loud in 3 years. Nora's breath caught. This was trust, raw and real. Anna, she repeated softly, honoring it. It's a beautiful name. She would have liked you, Caleb said. Then, softer, I think you would have liked her too. It wasn't a promise of forever, wasn't a proposal or a declaration. It was just two people, both carrying losses, choosing not to carry them alone anymore. Caleb put his hat back on, touched the brim. I'll be by tomorrow. That roof needs proper fixing. Tomorrow, Nora agreed. He held her gaze a moment longer, then walked down the steps toward his horse. She watched him go, but this time she knew he'd return. Inside the school, the bell rope swayed in the breeze. Nora reached for it, pulled. The bell rang out across Dust Creek. Clear, strong. Not calling people to judgment this time. Just calling children to class. Lily looked up from her work, smiled, and took her seat. The others followed, settling into their desks, ready to learn. Sarah stood in the doorway, gave Nora a small nod, then slipped away toward town. Nora looked around her classroom, at the patched roof and the worn desks and the faces looking up at her with trust and hope. At the life she'd nearly given up. For the first time since Thomas died, she believed in tomorrow. Sometimes the value of our lives isn't measured by what we carry, but by what we choose to give even when we feel empty. If this story touched something in you, I'd love to know. What have you discovered was worth fighting for, even when everyone said it wasn't? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if Eleanor's story resonated with you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this waiting to be told.